I mean, I thought you liked me. I thought this was a dream come true for us.
It's your dream. You can't force a dream onto someone else, Dad.
Yes, I can. I can force a dream on you.
Why are you yelling?
Because it's a good dream.
We got no time for an intro on this one. We learned so much in 5.2, and it's only going to be more relevant in 5.3 and everything we know about that patch right now, because they just revealed so much about the dragons, the Pyro Sovereign, and what exactly is going to happen in Natlan in 5.3, ending the war, the history and relationship between dragons and humans. There is so much to discuss, and I'm sorry it's taken this long for me to talk about it. My entire family's been sick for over a week now, and it's been an absolute nightmare, but everyone's on the mend now, and it's finally time to talk about the crazy lore we got. Natlan's complete history of the dragons, why it is even the nation of dragons to begin with, and the fate of Natlan after 5.3 in the Archon quest is complete. Where will it leave us? What's funny about Natlan is it kind of reminds me of those old, very stereotypical fairy tales, where a knight or brave warrior slays the evil dragon. It's one of the most cliche fairy tales. But Natlan is a little bit different. It follows the same principle, but this is Hoyoverse, so there's always going to be more than meets the eye. And it seems like 5.3 is building up to be something similar. Now, it's impossible to make this video without talking about a little bit of spoilers. There's not going to be nothing crazy, but I'm going to give tons of warning before that happens. We're going to be breaking down the history of the dragon, the Ochkanatlan story quest, what all transpired, what we learned about the Pyro Sovereign, leading up to our current events, and where we're headed in 5.3. So again, I'll give lots of warning before I get into any spoilery stuff. But before we can talk about the dragons in Natlan, I am very quickly going to recap what actually happened to begin with. Most of you already know this story, but Teyvat was inhabited by only dragons at one point. And from what we're learning more and more about them, they were an incredibly advanced and intelligent species with civilizations, cities, but the primordial one came and defeated the dragons along with the dragon sovereigns and the dragon king Nibelung. Nibelung then left through the abyss. We don't exactly know where Nibelung went, but the dragons had to bend the knee, and they did, still living in Teyvat. The primordial one created humans, humanity, Celestia, and its four shades, along with other celestial beings known as angels. We also learned that elemental energy comes from light energy, or phlogiston, which is an important detail, because the dragons are the closest connected to the natural elements, all which stem from the light realm, which is where the dragons come from. But one thing we didn't know before that we're learning a lot more now is that the dragons had to find a way to coexist with humanity and the primordial one under their rule. Now, dragons were scattered across Teyvat, and we're not 100% sure what the sovereigns were doing during this time. But at least in Natlan, the dragons still had civilizations of their own. But unfortunately, that wouldn't last, as Teyvat would be literally ripped to shreds with the War of Vengeance, the great war in the heavens that took place. Nibelung, the Dragon King, would return with forbidden knowledge and abyssal powers or corruption, reigniting the war. The primordial one and the second who came would join forces to finally defeat, and it's hinted that they killed Nibelung. The dragons now officially defeated, but both humans and dragons suffered down in Teyvat, this probably being the most apocalyptic event in Teyvat's history. Civilizations were snuffed out on a whim, celestial nails cast to help mend the land, and this could very well be when abyssal corruption, or the abyss in general, was first introduced to Teyvat, which is obviously important when talking about Natlan, the nation that fights off the abyss the most. But there's an important reason why Natlan has the most abyssal trouble. Their ley lines are the most severely damaged out of any nation in Teyvat. And the reason for that is going to be important for not only this video talking about Natlan's history, but in 5.3 as well, and where we're headed within the story. What exactly happened to their ley lines? Well, like every nation and every element, there was a Pyro Sovereign named Ochkanatlan, a magnificently beautiful red and golden dragon, who wielded the powers of light, heat, and wisdom. During the time period where Nibelung was defeated and left, the heavenly principles took over. Ochkanatlan faked his own death and went into hiding, while the heavenly principles, or the primordial one, established their rules along with the shades and humanity. but it is said that over time he became decrepit, dwelling within a great volcano in Natlan. Now, we're not exactly sure how this happened, but the Pyro sovereign Xucatl got severely corrupted by the Abyss, along with his majestic gold and red color, now glowed with abyssal corruption, the great Pyro sovereign looking like a shadow of his former self. It doesn't explicitly say this, but I'm assuming during the War of Vengeance, the Pyro sovereign probably got corrupted by the Abyss that Nibelung brought. Along with the Moon Sisters dying, one of their corpses can be seen to this day, and I truly do believe that is the shattered moon we can see within the fall sky. When we got a glimpse of it, there is a very good chance that all of the angels, the Seelies, and the Shades got cast down and had to abandon Celestia in order to quarantine it off, which is probably why there's a fall sky now to begin with, due to the corruption Nibelung brought. And we know that beings from the light realm are very susceptible to abyssal corruption, and because he was so severely corrupted, Xucatl began to lay waste to Natlan's ley lines and annihilating entire cities. An abyssal corrupted Pyro sovereign is the exact reason why Natlan is so exposed to the abyss. The ley lines keep the abyss at bay. This is where the Shade of Death comes into play. They use their powers along with the other Seelies in the area to form the Night Kingdom. And the Shade of Death Ranova appointed one of their most trusted angels, who we now know as the Lord of Night, the same being that we talked to in 5.1, who now presides over the Night Kingdom. But during this time, nobody even knew about the Night Kingdom yet. And this brings us to Ochkanatlan. You see, dragons were very advanced, and some of them were very human-like. We know that they take human shape nowadays, but even back then. And one of the dragon sages, known as the wisest of dragons, foresaw the fall of his kin and the dragons due to their tendency to use violence to enforce their might. But he believed that if they shared their knowledge with other races, that they could thrive and integrate and unite as one. So the dragon sage stole a seed of phlogiston, a power derived from Xucatl himself, phlogiston being the power that all Natlan characters can use. It's what you see around the map and how they power up their overworld gimmicks. The Dragon Sage taught this to the humans, how to use the phlogiston, and because what we learned about phlogiston and the elements of Teyvat, this could have been the very beginning of how humans could use the elements. But it gets even crazier than that. The Dragon Sage lived on the floating islands that you can see right around the people of the Springs tribe. And the first human he gave the seed of phlogiston to was a human named Chak, or Chek. He also had a son named Ochkan, who ended up being a prisoner of the dragons for a while, and inherited the Flame Lord's blessing. Now what's interesting about his son is he was said to be half human, with gold patterns on his face, but also hated his dragon lineage. And this is funny, and I had a little bit of a moment when playing this quest, because I actually made a video not that long ago talking about the history of Teyvat's dragons. And I mentioned how there has gotta be quite a bit of humans or people that we've known for a while that probably have dragon lineage. I talked about the pointy ears, different races like Adepti, Yokai, or long-life species that have natural elemental abilities through the light realm. This just confirms something I thought for a while, that the dragons and humans have integrated together, both culturally and it seems quite literally. But Ochkan hated his dragon side, this mostly due to the fact that they imprisoned him. That is why he can be seen wearing a mask in all of the pictures that we see, but anyone that got a glimpse of his eyes or pupils, they could see that they were vertical. And Ochkan would become the leader or ruler of the Cinder City, also a loyal follower of the person or man who would become the first Pyro Archon, Shabalanque. I mean, we also seen this in Fontaine, a dragon that came from the Abyss, Elia. All of the Melusine that are a humanoid species within Fontaine, that are part of its society to this day, all come from that dragon and its remains. But despite the dragon sage that had a half-human son and introduced phlogiston to the humans, the weakest of the species, his son would grow to hate the dragons. We already knew the dragons had their own civilizations, their own cities. It's safe to say that it was much like Natlan is now, only the dragons had their own tribes in a sense. Between the Pyro Sovereign and the man that would become the first Pyro Archon. One thing we have learned about the dragons is that they are an aggressive species that don't take losses very well. I guess who can blame them? And knowing what we know now about the Pyro Sovereign, it's safe to assume why it was in Natlan's best interest for somebody to take the ancient beast down, being corrupted by the Abyss. Shabalanque also showed compassion towards Ochkan, and because he already hated the dragons, he became one of Shabalanque's most loyal followers, along with several other historical figures in Natlan. And Shabalanque would square up with the Pyro Sovereign, having an epic battle. It is even stated that part of their battle, they were both free-falling, Shabalanque stabbing the Pyro Sovereign in the eye. Both the warrior and the dragon would die in this great battle, so we think, but Shabalanque would be revived by the primordial flame, dealing with an abyssal corrupted sovereign, but also realizing that the Abyss in general will be a long-running threat to Natlan for years to come, needed a way to protect Natlan long after his life was even over. This is where he made a deal with the Shade of Death, Ranova, bargaining with the ruler of death to borrow her power in order to establish the rules that would aid Natlan in its fight against the Abyss for years to come. The Ode of Resurrection and the pilgrimage of the return of the Sacred Flame would now begin, its tradition being upheld to this day. This would allow warriors that fought against the Abyss relentlessly to be brought back, but also allow mortals to ascend into Pyro Archonhood, something that was probably never meant to happen, but a unique situation between a mortal and a Shade of Death left them no choice. And like we know with all the Pyro Archons, they had the power of an Archon, but they still had the lifespan of a mortal or human. So unlike all of the other Archons that live a very long time, there has been many Pyro Archons over the years. After his friend and ally ascended to the Divine Throne and became the first Pyro Archon, Ochkan took the reins of authority and proclaimed himself the Sacred Lord of the Cinder City. And although people were awaiting Shabalanque's successor, the person that would be the second Pyro Archon, Ochkan believed that Shabalanque should remain the one and only Pyro God. And Ochkan, out of his bitterness towards dragons, would break the commandments left by his ally, the first Pyro Archon, regarding peaceful coexistence between humans and dragons, establishing a city where heaven and earth were separated from each other. During this time, dragons were prosecuted greatly, Ochkan banning people from practicing live sacrifices and forbidding people from worshipping the Night Kingdom, the same kingdom and rules the Pyro Archon himself established with the Shade of Death, and used the Turnfire to oppress anyone who opposed him. His hatred towards dragons and tyrannicalness would only grow over time, becoming erratic towards the end of his life. The great dragon sage and his father would later arrive and scold him for his actions, but he defended his own actions as it was better for humanity, losing sight of the bigger picture of a coexistence between dragons and humans. Now, over the years of this happening, the first Pyro Archon would eventually pass away, and a party of heroes were successful at overthrowing Ochkan, one of them being known as the Scarlet-Eyed Hero. This would be the individual that would actually ascend into Pyro Archonhood and become the second Pyro Archon in Natlan's history, taking the mantle and the rules of death that come with it. The Scarlet-Eyed Hero revealing that Ochkan looked fearsomely draconic, being one of the few people alive that's seen him with his mask off. It is said that Ochkan fell from a great height into a pitch-black mire and met his end. However, he actually survived the battle and split his mind and body in order to protect the people of Ochkanatlan before being used by, and then it says, that person as the Abyss conduit. His body became the dragon feared by the people of Natlan to this day, and his mind was stuck in a core until it was discovered by Bana at some point in the past, who freed it and gave him a name, Kukuik. Bana would eventually die from unknown means, and Ochkan regretted not being able to save her. When the traveler's actually traveling with Bana in the story, it's a memory of her that we're actually seeing, where we finally defeat the large purple dragon, Ochkan's body, and allow his body and mind to merge finally, comparing himself to Little One, as they both possess the Flame Lord's blessing. Now, before we can touch on where this is going with the future of Natlan and Genshin's story, let's talk about the Dragon Sage and his intentions. Was he simply trying to help humanity, the weaker race, help them evolve, and potentially help dragons and humans coexist, which is ultimately the end game and the end goal of Genshin Impact? Well, maybe, but I don't think it's so black and white. What we're learning about the dragons, although they're a proud and strong species, they are very, very vengeful. We might not know the reasons yet why the Primordial One came to Teyvat in the first place, but the dragon race, and it's been stated many times, believe that the weak should submit to the strong. That is the very reason their entire race fell apart once their king was overthrown and the sovereigns defeated soundly by the heavenly principles and the Primordial One. Whether you agree with Celestia actually being in the right or wrong, it's undeniable that they are the apex of Teyvat now. And Nibelung brought the worst possible thing to Teyvat, the Abyss and forbidden knowledge. Whether you're a dragon or a human, it doesn't matter. The Abyss comes for all, and it will be the death of everything. It is the single greatest threat, an enemy to archons, dragons, humans, adepti, or anything alike. The Dragon Sage was cultivating his son, a half-human, half-dragon, to probably overthrow, kill, and take up the mantle of the Pyro Sovereign. That was his goal, but it backfired as his son grew to hate the dragons and became a tyrannical ruler that not only did not ally with the dragons but became the biggest oppressor of dragons. The irony. Children really do like to do the opposite of what their father wants, don't they? But I believe the sage did have some wisdom here, although he might have been gaslighting and manipulating the situation, which he's probably doing currently with us and Little One right now. The evolution of dragons is driven by survival of their environment. So in order for the dragons to become better, they had to change. When the Primordial One took over with its shades, for better or worse, Teyvat was no longer the same. It was no longer inhabited solely by dragons. And the humans were brought here and created by the Primordial One. Dragons would definitely have to learn to coexist or perish. But we know from even Economia, the dragons had a hard time accepting this. So I truly believe that the Dragon Sage taught the humans how to use the elements in phlogiston, and then created a half-dragon, half-human son. Yes, he was always using his son Ochkanatlan to be a tool, to bring the two races together, culturally and biologically. But I think the reason he wanted his son to overthrow the Pyro Sovereign and take the mantle for himself is because the dragons only follow the strong. And if his son, a half-human, half-dragon, could become the next sovereign, then the dragons would follow suit and evolve accordingly for their survival. Maybe in the long run, the Dragon Sage planned to just kind of push the humans off to the side, while the dragons would become the stronger new humans under the Primordial One or Heavenly Principles' nose. If you've watched any of my videos recently in the last month or so, I've talked a lot about how Nibelung, the Dragon King himself, might have been manipulating the nation of Conria from the very beginning. This goes right hand in hand with that, as it's a brilliant way to integrate with humanity but also survive and eventually take over. Unfortunately, it did not go his way, as his son allied himself with the human hero Shabalanque, who ended up slaying the Pyro Sovereign, and when the Pyro Sovereign died, the dragons did not know what to do. All they ever did was follow the strong and obey the sovereigns, so their civilization started to decline. And now this brings us to 5.3 and where we're headed in the story going forward to finally rid the Abyss from Natlan for good and end the war permanently. Something that we also know as a lot of dragons, according to Apep, embrace the Abyss or forbidden knowledge. Even Apep themselves consumed all of the knowledge that King Deshard inherited, trying to do the same thing as everyone else in this game, defy Celestia, the heavenly principles, and the laws and rules that are Teyvat. And we know that the Hydro Archon perished, so the Shade of Life created Egeria, the first Hydro Archon, to replace the Hydro Sovereign as the heart of the Primordial Sea. We don't know how the original Hydro Sovereign perished, but it was reincarnated as Nibelet, maybe also due to the Abyss. Then that brings us to the Pyro Dragon, who was severely corrupted, so badly that they started laying waste to the ley lines. The reason Apep didn't go completely mad was due to Nahida and her intervention, but it seems that in Natlan, their solution was to just kill it. I guess that's the difference between the Nation of Wisdom and war. Shabalanque just killed him. But what's interesting is that they go out of their way to tell us that the Pyro Sovereign faked its death in order to stay low-key when the Heavenly Principles defeated the dragons and took over Teyvat, while Nibelung took off into the Abyss to gain forbidden knowledge and abyssal powers, reigniting the War of Vengeance many years later. It would almost seem like the Pyro Sovereign was waiting for their king's return, for the reignition of the war. The dragons were bitter about their loss, so it would seem to me all evidence suggests that Xuchotl willingly took this corruption and abyssal powers to help challenge Celestia during the War of Vengeance, but got way too corrupted, lost sight and control of himself, and became a threat, and has rumored to be remaining to this day. But that's the part that doesn't make sense. If the first Pyro Archon killed the Pyro Sovereign, then how is he still around, and why hasn't there been a reincarnation of the Pyro Sovereign since? There should have been. Dragons and humans in Natlan have evolved to coexist and live together, much more than any other nation. Now, everything we just talked about is going to be very important going into 5.3. And now here's where the spoiler warning comes into play. Feel free to click off the video now if you do not want to be spoiled with anything remotely regarding 5.3. I'm not going to be touching on any crazy leaks or anything like that, but I do have to touch on a minor one because it's literally impossible to avoid talking about it at this point. Unfortunately, leaks are part of the game, so for me to not even acknowledge it at this point doesn't really make sense. I'm not going to be showing any pictures or visuals or anything like that, just talking. But here's your spoiler warning now. If you're sticking around, I'm assuming most of you have seen the leaks of the new boss we're going to be getting in 5.3. A giant abyssal fiery dragon, known as the corroded Lord of the Primordial Flame. Now, it's fairly obvious this is going to be the Pyro Sovereign, and is basically going to be a reenactment of the first Pyro Archon slaying the dragon. We will be venturing into the Abyss with the current Pyro Archon, Mavuika, to put an end to the war in Natlan, put this to bed for good, and honestly put the Pyro Sovereign out of its misery. From what I can see, the design of this boss fight in general looks epic, but it's kind of funny. In Fontaine, we got to team up with a Sovereign, and in this patch, we're going to be probably killing one. But you might be thinking, well, won't this just be an abyssal hologram version of... Not exactly. I do think it might be his physical body. Once Shabalanque killed Xuchotl, I do believe that the Pyro Sovereign was officially killed and dead. But due to the intense abyssal corruption, maybe he either didn't quite die, or his body's just being used like a puppet or vessel by the Abyss, which might just reveal a more sinister individual or boss. Somebody from the Abyss lurking, that's able to control a Pyro Sovereign or its corpse, as one of the most terrifying bosses we're probably going to get thus far. Still able to wield the Primordial Flame, but if I'm guessing, I think it's going to be the Pyro Sovereign still alive, but just very corrupted at this point, losing every bit of himself but the will to fight and destroy everything in the name of the Abyss. But where does that leave Natlan and its story? How is this going to conclude? This is where I'm just going to give my best predictions based off what we know, is that something's going on with the Heavenly Principles. Something sinister, and we don't know quite what. Are they looking out for everyone? Why did they usurp Teyvat to begin with? What's beyond the false sky? We have all these questions, but one thing we do know is that there's been a lot of injustice throughout the years. We just saw a Hydro Archon sacrifice herself and her divine throne to reinstate the Hydro Dragon, which was Neuvillette, back in 4.2. That is how Fontaine's story wrapped up. And I do believe Natlan will do something similar. I think once we finally kill the original Pyro Sovereign, a being that's been suffering for years, we might actually be able to see a reincarnation of the Pyro Sovereign. Maybe that's going to be Little One, who has been an important companion throughout every single quest in Natlan. Maybe they take up the mantle of the next Sovereign, bringing humans and dragons even closer together, allowing the Pyro Archon to step down from her placement, no longer needing the Night Kingdom and the rules of the Lord of Death, so that Mavuika can actually continue living. and give up her authority. I'm not gonna lie, the Traveler becoming the Pyro Archon and that's how we gained our Pyro powers still sounds really cool, but maybe we are able to either save the Pyro Sovereign and absorb all of its corruption, or witness the reincarnation of a new one. Being that the Pyro Sovereign is the original authority of Pyro, then gain the Pyro powers for the Traveler, which couldn't come at a better time, because it's looking like the Captain, somebody that just talked about how the Shade of Death is behind Conrian's immortality. It's definitely looking like he's going to try to finally kill the Shade of Death. As he tells us, no rules are unbreakable. Nothing is truly set in stone. If the Shade of Death dies, and this is true, then the Pyro Sovereign being reinstated, much like Fontaine, couldn't come at a better time. The ley lines can now heal officially. With the Abyss completely gone from Natlan, the never-ending war with the Abyss resolved. It's over. The ley lines can heal. There would be no need for the Shade of Death and her rules being resurrected. And in turn, Mavuika, who's going to be playable in 5.3, won't have to die, as a rule, told to us by the Lord of Night in 5.1. That I think would be a great segment into transitioning into Shesnaya. And I think the Captain, for saving her life, by eliminating the rule of death, would actually probably be rewarded with the Pyronosis, the one thing the Fatui want more than anything else. The Captain would have succeeded in his 500-year-long mission to save Natlan from the war and from the Abyss, while simultaneously getting the Gnosis. This would also resolve the explanation as to how the Traveler gets the Pyro powers and the Pyro Archon currently gets to keep her life, but also give up her authority and her Archonhood to the Pyro Sovereign, which my guess is either going to be Little One inheriting it or Shukatl being saved by us. But then it opens an even bigger question. We just learned from the new glider wings, the Xbox wings. In my last video that I just made, I talked about how the Abyss siblings don't actually purify elemental energy but absorb it. What happens if they absorb too much? It's looking a lot like our Abyss sibling has absorbed too much, being hinted to have caused, or at least partially caused, the Cataclysm. Now, if the Traveler is a significant reason as to why the Pyro Sovereign gets to live without that corruption anymore, what's gonna happen to us? Absorbing that much abyssal energy if that's the case. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out. I also think the Pyro Sovereign having a redemption arc, even after willingly taking on the abyssal powers back during the War of Vengeance, also kind of lines up because we could see from Apep that Apep was bitter towards humans, even the Archons, and also wanted to absorb that forbidden knowledge to help the Dragon King. But even Apep came to regret that decision. A bad decision being made in the quest for vengeance against the usurpers. Even Neuvillette, who is a reincarnation and did not take place during those wars, still has some bitterness and vengeance in his heart from his voice lines. So I do think this all kind of checks out chronologically for the Pyro Sovereign's motives and moving forward. But I'm incredibly excited to play 5.3 and see where this goes. And also, as a side note, if you've actually seen what the new boss is going to look like, it looks incredible. It looks a lot like the Dragon Sage but on steroids, wielding two swords. It looks perfect for a Pyro Sovereign in my opinion, and the Nation of War. But let me know your thoughts in the comments. What are you hoping for Natlan? How do you think this is all going to end? Maybe you have a completely different idea as where you see this all going, and I would love to hear it. But thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Like and subscribe if you'd like to see more content like this, and as always, we will see you all in the next one. Later.